If you've never read a graphic novel before, it can be easy to write them off as children's literature or say that they're not real reading, but today I want to walk you through a brief history of graphic novels and let you know that they're important to both kids and adults. Let's get into it. Before we hop into where these originated, I want to quickly touch on the difference between graphic novels and comic books, as those terms are sometimes used interchangeably but are not synonyms. While they both feature illustration-based storytelling, there are some distinct differences between them. A graphic novel, as you may have guessed from the name, is a novel that uses a typical story structure and tells a complete story via illustrations. Typically, they'll offer the same kind of resolution that you might expect from a novel, even if that book is part of a series. And as a result, they tend to be a little bit longer and more substantive than a comic book, which is a serialized excerpt from a larger narrative. Comics contain only a part of the story, and they're typically released on some sort of a regular publishing schedule. The first graphic novel was published in 1842 by Rodolphe Töpfer and was called The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck. And yeah, dude had some adventures for sure. From what I could tell, this was intended to be a pretty comedic story, and it wasn't originally intended for publication. Throughout the book, Obadiah is confronted with all sorts of obstacles that prevent him from being with the woman that he loves. He gets dueled by a rival suitor, jumped by highwaymen, forced into a vow of celibacy by monks, mistaken for dead, chased by the police, and then sentenced to execution by burning. And that's not even half of what takes place in this book. There's some seriously dark stuff that unfolds, so I'll leave some trigger warnings down in the description in the event that you try to go read this for yourself, or if you settle for the Wikipedia page. Later that century, in 1895, we saw the first successful comic book character emerge. The Yellow Kid was a character in the comic strip Hogan's Alley, which featured a kid living on the streets of New York. He was bald, and he probably had to shave his head because of head lice. He roamed around the city in a yellow hand-me-down nightshirt, hence the name. The two newspapers that ran the Yellow Kid, Pulitzer's World Journal and Hearst's Journal American, soon became known as Yellow Kid papers. The term yellow journalism was soon tossed around and used to describe the newspaper's editorial practices of taking sometimes fictionalized sensationalism and profits as their priorities in journalism. Sounds familiar? A collection of the comic strip was eventually published in a book by Hearst. Hogan's Alley was filled with some pretty odd characters, mostly other children besides the Yellow Kid. Throughout the comic, we see them speaking in broken English that's a bit hard to follow at times, and they use some pretty weird slang. Wait, hold on. Go back one more. Is that a wedding for children? Are those babies? Okay. Nope. Let's move on to 1930, where we saw the first graphic album released with Tintin in the land of the Soviets. It follows the story of a young Belgian reporter named Tintin and his fox terrier dog, Snowy. Together, they travel to Moscow and are commissioned by the conservative Belgian newspaper to report on the politics of Stalin's government. His intent to expose the regime's secrets prompts agents from the Soviet secret police to hunt him down with the intent to kill. Yikes. A few years later, in 1934, we saw the release of Famous Funnies #1, which was the first comic book sold to the general public through newsstands. It was the brainchild of Maxwell Gaines, who, like a lot of other Americans at the time, needed money. He was cleaning his mom's attic one day and got distracted by an old pile of newspaper comic sections. He thought that if he enjoyed reading old comics, other people might too, so he approached Eastern Color Printing about making comics available to the public. But they were already doing that. They would occasionally publish tabloid-sized reprints as promotional giveaways. Gaines was able to convince them to cut the size in half and increase the number of pages to 64 so that they could fit more comics into the books. They soon began publishing them monthly, but they stiffed Gaines by cutting him out of the deal and keeping the comic book for themselves. Moving on to 1938, we have Action Comic #1, which is arguably one of the most famous comic books because it features the first appearance of Superman. It sold for 10 cents, which is about $2 in today's money, and Action Comics ran for 904 numbered issues before they restarted their numbering in the fall of 2011. They returned to their original numbering in 2016 and reached issue number 1000 in 2018. The numbering situation was a bit of a mess, so I'll leave a link in the description that explains it better than I can. In 2014, an original copy was sold on eBay for $3 million. Between the 50s and 70s, we saw a rise in popularity in comics like Archie and Mad, which later became Mad magazine. It had a pretty heavy satirical lean and ran for 67 years. And remember that guy, Maxwell Gaines, the one that got stiffed in the deal with Eastern Color Printing on publishing famous Funnies? Yeah, well, he went on to found the company EC Comics, which published Mad and some other titles like the Tales from the Crypt series, but he unfortunately died in a boating accident before seeing the successes of either. Tales from the Crypt became incredibly popular, but in the late 1940s and early 1950s, comic books came under attack from parents and clergymen and teachers who believed that the books contributed to illiteracy and juvenile delinquency. Moral panic swept the nation, parents burned comic books in public, and the comic book industry was on the brink of destruction. The very first manga in Japan appeared in the 12th and 13th century, but in 1969, female manga artists came together and formed a collective known as Year 24 Group. They produced shōjo manga, comics aimed mostly at young females. Shōjo manga of the 1950s and 60s largely consisted of simple stories marketed towards elementary school girls, but the works by members of the group dramatically pushed shōjo manga by expanding it to new genres and themes and subject material. The narratives and art styles became more complex, and they started to examine topics like psychology and gender, politics, and sexuality. Their work has been thought to be what brought the shōjo category into its golden age. Moving along to 1978, we saw the publication of A Contract with God by Will Eisner, which many call the true first graphic novel, though, as you may have noticed from everything that we've discussed so far, that's pretty hotly debated. The book is technically a collection of 4 short stories based on Eisner's childhood memories of immigrant life in the 1930s Bronx. The stories featured thematic patterns like frustration, violence, and ethnic identity. Eisner used large monochromatic images, and very few panels and captions have the traditional borders around them. Finally, we arrive in 1986 with a publication of Mouse by Art Spiegelman. It follows his own parents' story in Poland during the 1930s and describes their experiences as the Nazis invaded and persecuted the Jewish population. It represents Jews as mice, Germans as cats, Poles as pigs, Americans as dogs, the British as fish, the French as frogs, the Swedish as deer, and the Roma as butterflies. Over time, it's been classified as a memoir, biography, history, fiction, autobiography, and a mix of all of those things. In 1992, it became the first and so far the only graphic novel to win a Pulitzer Prize. Oh yeah, and it's banned. Yeah, it's been challenged and banned a lot since its publication, but most recently, a Tennessee school board removed it from 8th grade curriculum, calling it demented. I'll leave a video in the cards and down in the description on the history of book banning, but I feel like diving into the banning of comic books is a whole video in and of itself. As you may have seen from the last couple books, graphic novels aren't limited to just fiction. It's more of a catch-all term that includes fiction, nonfiction, and anthologized works. Some writers in the comic industry think that the term graphic novel is unnecessary or a marketing gimmick, and that comics should suffice. Some say that calling it a graphic novel puts the novel in some way higher than the comic. Hopefully, this quick dip into their history inspires you to read one, regardless of what you choose to call them.